Okay, let's start in about 3 to 4 minutes.
On
And
the side of
maybe,
the podium, on the side of the podium, the attendance sheet. So just pass that around the first hour when it.
yeah, it's going around. No issues, Eli.
Thank you.
Did you have any problems loading the second notebook?
Sorry.
Oh, great.
Really?
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't so bad for me. But it's good that Max takes me all around.
Thank you.
I got a tour of LA too.
Hello.
So what do you do? You're sure. What do you do here?
I'm a student here, a graduate student, PhD student.
Oh,
Yeah.
what department?
Electrical and computer engineering.
Are you planning just to teach or you're thinking of?
No, I already got a job, so I'll be going to Apple.
Oh.
This is all being recorded, by the way.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, it's
So
you are.
probably
That's
want to
okay.
pause what you're
We'll keep
saying.
it casual, Eloy. No, not to worry.
I know, but just might want to pause this because people all over the world are going to hear this.
That's okay, honestly. So, yeah, I already signed for you. Think not to worry.
So what position is it?
That's getting too specific. So maybe after the recording is over. Hey, what's up? Okay. Oh, here's the attendance. So we can get started. So we went through a lot of the pain points maybe yesterday with the introduction of what in general language models are. And we started off talking a little bit about the different libraries in Python, such as NumPy, Torch, pandas to load the files. And we even ran a few simple classification problems on the iris dataset using Scikit-Learn. And so I think at least for a workshop level course, we have all the different parts to start talking about large language models. And before we get talking about what they really are, perhaps we can jump right into code, almost like a a straight application to get ourselves back into the groove here. So let's jump to the tutorial day 1 notebook. So let's go all the way down to. It'll be good if you can do stuff just like yesterday. I think that really facilitates learning. So this is from day 1. This is the same notebook. Are we there? I'll wait for 2 minutes. Yeah, before we figure out exactly what's going on. So we're all here. We're good to go. Okay. So we don't understand anything about this code, and that's okay. Okay. The first thing we're going to do is just jump into it, and then we'll slowly take apart all the different things that are happening here. So please go ahead and run the first cell here. The pip install guidance transformers. So as you're running these cells, I'll just give you an overview of kind of what's going on. What we're going to do is try to infer or try to run one large language model that's available on open source locally on our Google Colab, and just look at some of the sample outputs that it generates. So this starts to build our intuition about what these things do. That's what the transformers package allows us to do. So the transformers package allows us to connect to this open source repository of the different models that other people have built. So if you're trying to build your own GPT models in-house, ideally you would also install the transformers library and start off by downloading a pre-trained or a checkpoint that someone else has built and try to iterate on that. That's what the transformers package does. The guidance package is a nice UI wrapper around the transformers package. What guidance does is that it helps you to format your input prompts into these transformer models. So if I take a large language model, remember that a large language model goes from text to text. Now, of course, I can directly run inference through these large language models, like how I showed you earlier in the slides. So let's take an example. If you recall all the way back here, this was a simple large language model example we showed where we had an input prompt and we got the output generated for us from the LLM. Now, here, what we're using guidance for is guidance will take your input prompt, it'll break it up in a way that the LLM can understand. These small little parts are then fed into the large language model that you are loading up and playing around with using transformers, and then you get the output. So guidance helps you prompt the models that you are running through transformers. If you are a pseudo user of large language models, oftentimes you will skip the guidance part entirely. And in fact, we will be able to do that by the end of this workshop, and you will directly just use the transformers model without any guidance support. You'll be able to interact with the model at a very fundamental level. Okay, but for now, since it's only a teaser, we are going to be using the guidance library. So hopefully you ran all this, it installed a bunch of things for you. And the next part here, you will notice that from this library, just like from NumPy, we imported some things. Now what we're doing is from the transformers library, you will always notice with a large language model, there are two parts. There's something called a tokenizer, and there's something called a model. Now, does anybody have an intuition about what the tokenizer does? We have already talked about this. Yeah. That's right. So if you have QC Bio workshop, like the example we did yesterday, what the tokenizer will do is that given a sentence or given any input prompt, it breaks it down into little pieces. And you'll actually be running these individually to see how they work. Okay, so not to worry. Now, all these different tokens are then input into the model, which is really the large scale language model. And the model runs some kind of an inference using these pieces. Yeah. That's a great question. Your peer is asking, irrespective of the model, is the tokenizer the same? And the answer is no. Depending on the model, each model can have a different way of tokenizing the same input. And that is why whenever you are trying to load a tokenizer and model, you have to make sure that the version you are trying to load is the same. Every model path comes with its own tokenizer and model. And if you mix and match these, you will get horrible results. Because the tokenizer, the way you're breaking down a prompt, and the way the model has learned to process these different tokens are entirely different. Okay? So now you might ask me, hold on a minute, what is all this? Where is this path coming from? How am I specifying the tokenizer and the model to do some kind of task with LLMs? And this path is basically a path that you can find on an open source repository that we will get into later today, and that is called Hugging Face. So different contributors from all over the world come up with small little catchy names for these language models that they train. For example, GPT. Others might be things like, you might have heard of Llama, and you've recently heard of Sora. So all of these are different types of language models, and we will actually see how to get these paths for us from the Hugging Face, from this open source collection. So let's not worry about that right now. What is critical to understand, however, is that given such a name, what the transformers model can do for you is get you the tokenizer and the model that is, first of all, aligned to each other, and second, that are both required for you to do any kind of inferencing using a large language model. Question so far? I know we're left a lot hanging, but this is like a trial by fire. One more thing I want to point you to, it says 1.1b here. Any idea what that means? Any hunch? Yeah, so it's 1.1 billion parameters. So this tiny large-scale language model that you've just loaded in Google Colab has 1.1 billion parameters. Maybe we don't understand the significance of this, but if you look at something like the tiniest ResNet, which is often used for image classification, you would see parameters from about 10 million to 50 million parameters. This language model that we're currently loaded has 1.1 billion parameters. So it's a complete order different, 20 times more parameters. Any idea what chat means? Right? So what that means is that this large-scale language model has been specifically trained for it to generate chat-style continuations. So if I start a chat with it, this tiny llama model has been pre-trained to start generating chat-style outputs. So if I say, hey, how are you? The model is probably going to respond, I'm fine, how are you? So it has more chat-heavy training data. This chat here refers to the type of training data that these LLMs have been exposed to. V1.0 is trivial. That just tells you that this is the first version of this model. Any questions here?
So you tokenize that.
What's up?
Are we tokenizing that?
No, we are not. We are only loading the tokenizer here. We will do the tokenization based on the input prompt. For example,
So that's the model.
that is right.
But how come model is assigned? Like auto tokenizer, auto model could kind of like those are packages.
Yes, those are paths, like a specific, you can imagine there's a computer somewhere, there's a path, and you're just loading two parts of the LLM. The tokenizer, which splits your input into multiple parts, and the model that processes these multiple parts. Yeah, question.
The number of parameters is related directly to the size of the neuron.
That's correct.
Yes, and it tells you an idea how big is the data that you use to pre-train.
That oftentimes depends on how open source the model is. So it depends on how these open source collaborators and contributors really deploy their model. So if you go and find a model, like for example, Llama, they might tell you, okay, look, we trained it on this data set that has like a terabyte of data or a couple gigabytes of data. But other models where they might not even expose to you what data it was trained on. In fact, some of the earliest versions of these models that were made open source were found to contain a great amount of PII, personally identifiable information, because they were trained on data that the users who were using the model didn't know that that data was being used to refine and fine-tune their models. So yeah.
Is there a language without the tokenizer?
Is there a language model without the tokenizer? I think what you will see is that fundamentally the tokenizer is important for modeling language, and we will get to understanding why in just a little bit. Yeah.
Why can't we use data? Why do we have to use?
Yeah, why can't you use your own data? Why do you have to use their pre-trained language model? So what you're saying is, I will just specify the entire model, and I'll just train it on your data, and just hope that that works, and that's totally fine. The problem is that in most use cases, you don't have enough information and data points to train an entire model from scratch. But more importantly, you don't have the compute to train these models from scratch too. Most of us don't. And so what people usually resort to doing is they first take a model that's been trained on this large scale data by someone else, and then they adapt it. They make small modifications either to how you prompt the model, or maybe further refine the model a little bit in training it, so as to make it suitable for your use case.
What do people use large language models?
Oh, well, as we mentioned earlier, large language models are used mostly for generative style applications. For example, things like creative writing, or maybe you want to draft an email and you're just brain dead and you can't do it at any point. And you're like, okay, well, I'm kind of really rusty right now. I don't know how to write this. What do I do?
Like Grammarly.
Kind of like Grammarly. In fact, I think ChatGPT can do many of the things that Grammarly does. And I think they're even doing some kind of collaboration with Grammarly. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you use
So the question is, if you want to use healthcare data, what are some of the challenges and things that you have to consider? The most important thing I'll mention to you is you should not use something like ChatGPT for healthcare data. The reason is, of course, that ChatGPT would use that data and then train their models further. So you can't expose that data to something like GPT 3.5 or GPT 4. There's much stronger models that are available from OpenAI. So instead, what you need to do is find a very good model that you can host locally, like something like a tiny llama or something maybe a little bigger with your compute that you can have at your offices, to kind of not use GPT, but use a more local machine that won't continually adapt to the data that you're providing it. Yeah. Question.
Or your own
Mhm.
So once I open this draft, for example, ChatGPT, I try to make the first, like, I want to use this to write papers, so it's
Yeah.
over the field lots of time.
Mhm.
And now, given it has this all this data, it becomes much slower to generate tax.
Yeah.
Is that something how is because I trained it for my specific purpose, so it make it run slower, or
There's a very specific reason for that, but we'll get into it a little later. You need to understand the architecture of an LLM to understand why that's happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
So we are using ChatGPT, so are the other using hospitals. I don't know what's going on with them, but for us, we run into these kind of weird issues in ChatGPT. So what models do you recommend?
So there is something called the Llama Chat 70 billion, not 1.1, but 70 billion. That seems to be a good open source and locally hostable replacement to ChatGPT that you can consider using for these tasks. Okay, so let's move on. Clearly, there are many questions here and there are many things going on, but now comes the fun part. So without really understanding what's going on, we will play around with this part of the code here. So this part is meant to show you how the tokenizer works. So you're given a text, welcome to this class. And what we do is we use the tokenizer and say encode. And as we have mentioned many times, what the tokenizer does is that it breaks up an input prompt into multiple parts. So go ahead and run this, and let's see what happens. Let's see what goes on. So I just ran this, and what you will see is you get a set of tokens. That's the first print statement, and that is a list of numbers, right? We don't know exactly what that's doing yet. And the second one is trying to reverse engineer the process. So given these numbers, the tokenizer dot decode takes these numbers, converts it back into text, and constructs welcome to this class. Okay. So now let me ask you to guess what these numbers might represent. So exactly, but can you be more specific? So you said index of a word. In what? Is that true? I see a number here, 21,829, and there are not that many. Yeah, exactly. So let's really dig into that in a bit. But what the tokenizer does is that once it splits a prompt into multiple parts, each part is mapped into a big vocabulary. So again, the tokenizer contains a big vocabulary of small little words. And as and when a prompt like welcome to this class is broken up into parts, it goes through this vocabulary and finds the index in that vocabulary where that word appears. Okay, think of it as a normal dictionary, right? So you go through the dictionary, you see a bunch of words. Now you see a prompt and you're like, okay, I see the word welcome, right? Where in my dictionary does that word appear? So these numbers basically refer to the position of the pieces that I get from the prompt in a much larger vocabulary, or we call it a vocabulary in language modeling, but you can think of it as a dictionary, like just a dictionary that you read through. Okay? Yeah. Exactly, which is why it is so important to make sure that your tokenizer, encoding, decoding, and the model, all of these are consistent, right? You don't want to decode with the wrong, it's like you're switching out the dictionary mid a processing, so you don't want to do that. So any guesses roughly how big this dictionary might be, or this vocabulary as we call it? That's a great question. It depends on the model. Again, it depends on the tokenizer. Roughly, in the order of... No. Thank God it's not that big, but it exists somewhere between 10 to 100,000 little parts, or we call these tokens. Okay, so you might expect to see about 50,000 tokens in a vocabulary. What's up? Oh, there is a chat message. Let me read that really quick. Can I ask a question? Yes, you may.
Hi, Pawan.
Yeah.
So my question is the text, which is welcome to this class. There are
Yeah.
4 words to that, but the list of token that you encoded there has like 5 tokens. So is it
Yes.
not one-to-one relation? It's like
Yeah. So a couple things here to point out. One is that a word is not equal to a token all the time. So we'll try and understand how these tokenizers are built. But what I'll say is this, that if you look into language and you notice that some words are more frequent than others, the chance that you will have them as part of your vocabulary is higher, right? So if I have a more complicated word, like my advisor's last name, which is Roy Chowdhury, it's unlikely that you want to add that into your vocabulary. Honestly, it's a waste of space, right? Because if I can have a word the versus a word Roy Chowdhury, which one would I more likely want to have in my vocabulary? The second. Why? Because it occurs more frequently. Whereas if I now have the word Roy Chowdhury, well, you know what I can do? I can break it up into word pieces. Things like Roy, Chow, the, Ri. So you can break up words into multiple tokens. And that is in fact done. If you impose a limit like 50,000 on your vocabulary size, the way the tokenizer is trained is that it goes through the entire text data and finds the most common recurring small little pieces. And it builds this vocabulary from smallest, the shortest, to longest. Make sense?
Find the most
Yes.
words to text.
Yes. Now, that still doesn't address your question in this specific part. You're asking me, what is this one token that's showing up in the first position? Because in this case, it turns out, Satpal, that you're absolutely right, that there should be just 4 tokens, but indeed we get 5. And the first token here that we get is this S token. I won't get into too much about what that is, but for now, it is sufficient to know that this is something that the model requires. This is a special token. It tells the model that this prompt starts from here. So why is this helpful? We'll come back to it later. If it's not yet clear by the end, then you can ask me again. Okay? Yeah, question.
Yeah, if you have some typos in the text, does the model recognize that?
So you know what we should do? We should actually try it, right? So let's go with something like that. Okay. CLAS. Okay. Let's see what happens. So you'll see that, in fact, the model had a very difficult time in breaking this up into exactly 4 tokens, because there's no way that this entire word has appeared a sufficient number of times in a large-scale corpus. So what it did instead is that it tried to break it up into individual parts. Maybe it detected that MD is a fairly common little piece of text, so it broke it up into class, MD, maybe EK, and maybe NF never appears, so it broke it up into individual letters, N and F. So the way of breaking a string or a prompt up into these separate pieces, that itself is its whole little research area, and it has its own different methods. So we use something called byte pair encoding, but you can look at that in your own time. But the fundamental idea is this, that you break it up into tiny pieces, and in case you find a word that is really difficult for you, you break it up into smaller and smaller pieces until you find it in your vocabulary. What's up? Oh, another question in the chat. Let me see. Any questions? I assume you can unmute and speak up. This room is equipped.
No, I was just saying that's okay because the people online can unmute themselves, and we do have a capacity where they could ask a question anytime, and that you can hear you in the classroom.
Oh yeah, yes, please. Yeah. Thank you.
So I just want to let them know, so because like whenever they have a question, they could just either raise their hand or just speak up. This is your class, so you tell them what to do.
Cool. Thanks. Yep.
Pawan, I had a question.
Yeah.
This is Raju.
Back to you. Yeah. What's up?
So when it is broken and converted to numerical format, what does that number mean? Why is it can be 1 to 30,000, right? So what does that number, does it represent anything?
Yeah, it represents an index in a big dictionary. So imagine that you bought yourself maybe an Oxford dictionary, and you started counting words from 1 all the way to however big that dictionary is. This number represents where this token, this piece of this text, is present along this dictionary, if you just started counting from 1 to the end.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, question here.
I think if you usually people would miss it.
Okay, you want to try that? There's a question here. Yeah. CLAS, like this.
My question is related that.
Okay, your question is related, yes?
Yeah, will the model can try to guess the correct meaning of the text? So that's why I asked.
It will not autocomplete for you. There's no autocompletion feature. And it won't give you the same, it will definitely not give you the same tokens. Uh-huh. That is true. It is able to generate the right answer. But when it is processing the input text, it is not autocorrecting the text. At least if you're just looking at the LLM. I don't know what they're doing in OpenAI at the back, trying to fix the prompt before they pass it in, but the model itself does not do this.
It could be a data structure, one is like a tree, these numbers could be a branch. Some kind of tree.
It is not. It is reflective of the position of that token in a dictionary. Okay. So, but you might envision that finding the matching word in a dictionary can be done via some kind of a tree data structure.
Because you can have multiple lines from it, and they were related in position.
100%. And it turns out that, in fact, something similar is used to come up with the vocabulary in the first place, but not really in terms of searching later. Yes.
I tried typing Apple before welcome. Even I was wondering if like the vocabulary goes alphabetic.
Yeah. It is not alphabetical. The dictionary is not arranged in an alphabetical manner. It is only about just the order in which it was processed. As I said, when you actually train the tokenizer, it goes from shortest to longest rather than any kind of alphabetical requirement. But that's a good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Does the model or the tokenizer like look at the punctuation? Like,
It does.
Question marks.
Those are also part of the vocabulary.
So it also understands those.
It converts it into tokens in the vocabulary list. Understanding will come later. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, stop words, yeah. You don't have to do that for these advanced large language models. They use it. Yeah, they use it as information because they have been trained on natural language. So removing stop words would compromise the meaning of the text. So especially for these high quality models, it'll actually hurt your model's performance to remove stop words.
One more question.
Yes.
How do you tokenize audio and video?
Oh, okay. Maybe I can talk about this when we talk about future applications tomorrow. That is difficult. They do things like quantization in different ways along the frequency, time domains. It's a big research area. How do you deal with video and audio input rather than text? Because even that would require a tokenizer on its own right. But again, let's not jump into that. Let's stay with text. Okay. So now, finally, I'd like you to run this last cell here, which is going to be a lot of fun. And this is a place where you can have fun with it. It's not the best model. Okay, so don't be underwhelmed or overwhelmed. But this is a prompt that I wrote, and here's a function, generate text. So let's see what it does. I take the prompt, I pass it into the function. Function will encode the prompt using the tokenizer. These tokens stored in input IDs are passed into the model. And what this max length parameter does is that it tells you how long should your response be? How many tokens should the model generate? Okay. We don't know how it's doing it, but we'll get into that in a bit. Okay.
You said I would get the prompt, you put it into.
So the prompt, it's all written up here. the prompt is input into this function generate text. Okay? Now, that prompt is encoded, as in it's broken up into its constituent tokens. That's what the first line is doing. The second line is taking these tokens and passing them into the model via the generate command, or the generate function. And there are two parameters extra that we are using. The max length parameter tells you that, okay, I want to generate 50 more tokens from here. So you might imagine that it works this way, that if I go here and give that as the input, the top line, I want to generate 50 more tokens, which basically corresponds to maybe some amount of text here. So the equivalent of a word is about 3 to 4 tokens on average. If I say 50 tokens, it means about maybe 13, 14 words, roughly. Yeah, right? Yeah, that makes sense, 13 words. And so if you say 50 tokens, it would generate the next, or a solution, the response with about 13 words, 13, 14 words. Yeah. 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 Yeah, so in practice, how that is done is when you are training, the generation is stopped when the model itself decides that I am done responding. And so you might ask how that is done. And so the way that's done is that during training, at the end of an answer, say you're training in a chat setting, and person A said something and person B said something, and then you're done. Now, the model is trained by adding a special token, like the one we saw, to the end of what person B said. So now when you're generating something from this model, you stop generating when you reach the special token. That can be adaptive. Depending on the model, depending on the query, these generations can be of various lengths.
So you put max length, it will respond
as long as it needs to, up to 50. So max length is more like a max length of generation. Yeah, question.
Let's say you have a max length 50. Does
Yeah.
it try to make complete sentence up to that 50, or does it just stop suddenly?
It's a greedy generation process to a large extent. So if you reach 50 tokens, and if it's not done with a sentence, it won't make an effort to complete it.
So it will not select some kind of answers that's important enough that's within.
It can't look ahead, at least to the extent that you want. We'll get into exactly what it does, but mostly it is greedy. Yeah. No, it's not. Roughly 2-3 tokens per word on average. Okay, so now the last part is doing a decoding of the output. So the model generated some tokens in output, and then we decode those tokens, which are again indices in a vocabulary, using this. Ignore the zero part. We'll get into those details in a bit. But skip special tokens equals true basically means that we are going to be ignoring these kinds of tokens, or the tokens that are useful for the mechanics of the model. Okay. So when you skip those tokens while decoding, you end up generating a good, well, not good, but one response to your prompt. So we're going to wait until it generates. Yeah. Question.
Yeah, but those are still part of the max length limit, right?
That is right. Yeah. It gives you an entire sentence. So there is enough information in the encoding of the tokens to specify spaces, to specify the same word, different word, punctuations, everything. The encoding to decoding process is lossless. Fair enough? So if you try to run it, you will notice that in fact you do get a very nice continuation. Do you want a joke or a poem? So as you can see, it's trained on chat, but it's not a very good model. And so it thinks that joke is an actor. And then it goes with joke colon, laughs, a poem. And actor 2 colon, great, here's a poem about the power of love. So it's a very trivial, it's not trivial at all. Maybe I said that wrong. This is extremely hard to do, but the quality may not be to the extent that you might see in ChatGPT, right? And so the reason for that is because ChatGPT is using like 30 billion all the way up to 200 billion parameters. We are able to generate this with just 1 billion parameters. What you should try now on your side is to extend it by increasing the max length to about 200 and see what you get. So if you try to do that, let's have it run a little longer and see what we get. To see, So as we're going through this, bear in mind that the model at this point has already learned most of what syntax is about, right? It didn't make a syntax mistake. It didn't make a capitalization mistake. It used the syntax, it turns out, is actually pretty easy to learn from language. And the model has learned it in a purely self-supervised way. Okay, this takes a while to run because I need to generate more tokens. So just give it some time. It has already learned the syntax, and we are just trying to infer from it and validate the fact that it has already learned the syntax. Yes.
I think when I just tried to run it, like the same
Yeah.
setting as we did, I got the same result.
Okay, so it probably reached
Not bad.
the end token.
Okay.
So it stopped generating after that.
No, I mean, so it's not kind of like I said, so it doesn't give different answers each time. What does it?
There is a way to set that,
Oh,
but currently the temperature, it's modified by this thing called a temperature parameter that we'll get into in a bit. But that temperature parameter will, in fact, make it more or less stochastic. Yeah. So here, when I ran it, I did in fact get a much longer response. So we got, you want a joke or a poem? Joke, a poem. Actor 2, great, here's a poem about the power of love. Audiences laughing and clapping. Yeah, isn't it interesting about how it's trying to do stuff?
Yeah.
What is one fact that you see here in this generation? What is something that, the quality is, you would say, because of this fact, the quality is not quite up to the mark? What is it that gives it away? So you're pointing out something very important, that there's repetition going on, right? So you see the audience has been clapping and cheering for a whole long time, right? And then there's at least this part, here's a poem about the power of, and then it just replaces it with some filler word. So what's going on is that, and this has been observed by people also, that these smaller models tend to get stuck in what we call self loops. So while the first few generated tokens are maybe useful, after that point, these models, the smaller ones, tend to get stuck in kind of a recursive loop where they keep generating the same thing over and over again without being able to move forward.
But this could be a advantage because this is a learn.
This is a what?
Learning. Like at the end, it could be an advantage.
That it repeats, right? Perhaps, maybe what you're saying is that if the model is able to repeat, maybe that is useful for learning new things going forward. Have I got that right? Yeah, I haven't quite thought about that. But I guess for a model that is already trained, we don't expect to have that, right? You would think that the repetition is good.
Or, for example, the genetic code,
Yes.
in some moment, there should be a learning process. It should be simple, but it should be flexible.
That's true.
And there is a moment that it starts repeating, even that you can have variants.
That's very cool.
The same amino acid.
Yes. I don't think people have used this property of the LLM as a strength, like the way you were saying with repeat regions in a genome. But it's quite interesting. Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Why don't you use something like this model? Some have a neuron generative disease, like,
Yeah, so can you use these models for discovery, right? So can you use these models to come up with things that were not previously known? And I think that's where a lot of these current discovery tasks are going, where because it's a generative model, you never know which way you're going to go. And so by prompting carefully, by modeling the prompt, by trying to get into spaces where the generative model can potentially go crazy, you might be able to discover new things as a result. Question here? Yeah.
I don't understand why the output is kind of like a conversation.
Yeah.
I feel like it's kind of trying to make some kind of like drama or like Shakespeare something. Is it because the model was trained on those materials?
On more chat style data.
Because I feel like our question didn't really ask for.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's been pre-trained on that kind of data. So it is insistent that it wants to generate in this kind of format. Yeah. Off to my meeting. Yeah, okay.
The OpenAI that we tried also did this.
Yeah, so it depends on the quality of model you use from OpenAI. If you use like the latest GPT-4 Turbo, it doesn't do this as much. They do? They repeat like this badly? Oh, I'd love to see some prompts later that gives some kind of result like this. But I will say that the larger the model, the easier it is to get out of these kinds of loops. There are also generation parameters in your code that you can add to prevent these repeats from happening and for the model to not repeat those tokens. We'll get into that also. Anyway, this was the teaser. Hopefully it's got you to ask more questions than give you more answers, but we'll get to the answers now. Okay? Everyone's the genome thing that he suggested was very exciting. We will get into a genomics application. Yeah. Okay, are we good with this part? Shall we move? Okay, let me see where we are on time. Okay, we're good on time. Maybe we'll, you know what we'll do? We'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll start because I want to start with some slides. So it's a good time to take a break and then resume here. Okay, I will pause the recording and we will resume in about 5 minutes. It doesn't show the green around my screen, so I'm a little. It says new share, but I guess I am sharing. Okay. Are you able to see my screen? Those of you who are online.
Yes, we can see the screen.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so let's get started with some slides. So large language models. So we've already played with them. So let's get into what's actually going on. So the problem is that language is not by default computation friendly. These are letters, right? How are we going to do any kind of computation with language? And so our models require some kind of numerical representation of these letters, words, phrases. And so what we saw in our small little experiment so far is this idea of tokens, right? So given an input context, this is an input text. What the tokenizer will do is that it breaks it up into these smaller parts, and we call them word pieces, tokens. In this case, we got lucky again, and each word corresponds to a single token. We see this is input. I guess text is missing, but that's on me. But imagine there's a text there, and then there's a full stop. Now, you might again ask, what is the CLS in the beginning and the SEP at the end. And the CLS and SEP, again, are these special tokens. They are what help the model to understand, okay, when does one text segment end? When does the other one start? When do I stop generating? When does the prompt end? ... Okay. Now, this is what we have discussed so far. Okay. Each of these words corresponds to a particular index in a big dictionary. So, for instance, in this dictionary, the word this would be the 2023 indexed word in the dictionary. And so we end up generating a list like that. Now, what happens? Well, each of these indices is tied to what we call a token embedding. Okay? These are how token embeddings look. This is an important part to understand. Every token, for example, the letter A, or the word this, or the word input, or the token is, all of these are associated to a vector representation, a numerical representation, an embedding. That's what we call them. A numerical embedding. That is this column vector here. Okay, so we get these column vectors, right? And so for a given token, there is a corresponding embedding. Who comes up with these embeddings? The model learns it. Okay, the model learns these embeddings using gradient descent, like we talked about last time. So this is learned by the data, but the process of generating continuations involves this first crucial step, which is that given a token, I generate an embedding. For all the tokens in the input, I generate some embedding. Okay, there is a model for this. For every token, there is an embedding being generated. Yes.
Are this embedding matrix, or the second question is that, or are this embedding matrix?
We'll get there now. But so what the task is to convert language, which is intrinsically not computation friendly, to a space where I can actually deal with language in a computational manner. And so the first step is to break it up into tokens. And then the second step is to encode these or map these tokens into a vector. And so each of these is a vector. And you're right, the embeddings matrix is basically the vector dimension times the vocabulary size dimension. So any idea how big these vectors are? Take a guess. How many dimensions do you think these embeddings are in?
The number of
No, that would be too big.
because I think this is a graph. This is a graph. Embedding is like reduce the dimension.
So you're saying that if I had the number of tokens as the dimension, then I could have a one-hot encoded vector representation for each token. Right? So you could have 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. You could have 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, right? I mean, that's what it would be. But the problem is that is, first of all, very sparse. And second of all, you kind of want these vectors to be able to interact with one another. So we'll see what that means in a bit. But you'll notice that having a 0, 1 vector like the one you proposed,
It could be another way to integrate the graph.
in a graph,
You have this word interacting with this word.
Yeah.
Rows.
yeah,
And
that is the entire point of these embeddings as well. So what we use cosine similarity, it turns out, between these embeddings to figure out which two tokens are close to one another. But we'll get into that. Okay. I'll get back to your question in a bit. I don't think I quite answered it. But yeah, I asked you to guess, what do you think is the dimension of each of these embeddings? No, it's just a guess. There's no intuition yet.
Maybe it's the same as your input,
Um,
like number of words. I think.
That's hard to do, right? Because different prompts will have different inputs. But what we want that if I'm given a token, this token embedding is the same, irrespective of the prompt that I'm using. They are definite. They're not probabilistic. Okay. So it turns out that there's this magic number you'll keep seeing. It's 768. Okay. Yes, we did. I added that intentionally. So each vector is of dimension 768 in most of these models. You're asking questions that you're not supposed to. So just take my word for it. People have tried with 384, 768, 1024, but the most common one is 768. Each token is represented by a 768 dimensional vector. Okay. And you have about 30,000 tokens in your vocabulary. And so if for every token, irrespective of the context, I need a predefined embedding to be returned, then every model, like any BERT, Llama, GPT, comes preloaded with an embeddings matrix of dimension 30,000 by 768, which is another 1,000. So 30,000 times nearly 1,000 would be how much? 30 million? So just here, to get these embeddings, we have used 30 million parameters.
Oh, so the embeddings is not of those 5 words, whatever it's.
These are the token indices in the vocabulary. For each token, there's additionally an embedding. Does that make sense?
Each of them has
Each of them has a full 768 dimensional representation in some space. It's a 1D array. Yeah. Yeah, question.
So the imbalance is irrelevant of the number of parameters each model has.
It
So
is.
no matter it's 1 billion or 7.
Yeah, these embeddings are learned as a process of the task of pre-training these models. So I would say that it is not maybe directly related to the parameter count, but rather it is a function of how the training went. So in practice, how do we do this? We initialize these to random. And then after a series of training sessions, the model itself learns how these embeddings needs to look to maximize the performance. Okay.
But no matter how you train it, it will always be 768.
That, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that doesn't change. That is the dimension of the model almost. Yeah.
Is it mathematically proven to be the optimal?
No, no. I guess it was just a hyperparameter choice, and they just went with it. Yeah.
Does it relate to the architecture of the computer?
It does not.
So it's kind of like if you were playing puppet
Mhm.
and like if you say every puppet has like a string and it's like of those other parameters.
Exactly. So yeah.
Attaching more parameters to your puppet would think it they did the inside of the cage. I have come through most of the head and most of the elbow. They got more thing about my puppet, but it's still my puppet.
Exactly. So the single token is represented by multiple features along the 768 dimensional vector, like the puppet's head, the hands, everything. So yeah, the token is represented by an embedding. Is it clear so far? This is the most important thing in the entire large language model. This translation from text to numerical representations.
Question one.
Yeah.
So for a specific token in a specific model, will the embeddings always remain the same, or is it dependent on the context in which that token is made?
So when we train it, these token embeddings will change. But when we are inferencing from the model and we are faced with a new prompt, these embeddings are guaranteed to be the same, irrespective of the context in which it's used.
Okay, thank you.
The context dependence will come later.
Okay.
Yeah. So these are just individual seeds. Now we will see how these embeddings, how the large language model works on these embeddings to do some cool things. Okay? Okay. Yes.
I have one last question. So when you tokenize the prompts,
Mhm.
does it change everything to lowercase?
That depends on the model. Some models are trained with lowercase, other models are trained with a mixed case. It depends on how you want to train your model. They sometimes like to change everything to lowercase because, of course, you can get more coverage by reducing the casing, right? You don't have multiple variations. So that's one of the reasons why we tend to remove the case sometimes.
I think the reason I asked is because that, for example, in this case,
Yeah.
You have a token to indicate the start of the string.
Yeah.
Right? But like the capital letter T in the this also indicates the start of the string. Right?
But you can't trust that.
Yeah.
If I say this is QC bio, where Q is a capital and C is a capital, then that's a problem, right? So yes, that could be a nice heuristic, but no, we don't use that. Okay, let's move on. Everyone's clear with this? So what are some properties we want in tokens? So if I give you an input prompt and I say, okay, let me break it up. You know what? I don't want to do all this word pieces stuff. I'm beyond that. Let me just use letters. Let me represent everything by a bunch of letters and a bunch of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 till 9. Maybe include 0 for kicks, some special characters, and then all the alphabets. So what if instead of breaking it up into word pieces like we just discussed, we instead said, I don't want to deal with 30,000 elements in my vocabulary, and instead I am happy just going with breaking it up into letters. Do we see any problems with that? Yeah, so it turns out that there is this fine line between the size of the tokens and the complexity of the model. So what does that mean? The smaller the tokens, the more permutations you would have using a very limited set of tokens to represent all the input text. So your model would have to be extremely strong in being able to disambiguate subtle changes in the token ordering. If you had very long tokens, the problem would be that your vocabulary size would explode. If I had a single token to represent this is an input text, and I had another token to represent QC Bio Lab, and I had another token to represent something else, that vocabulary size would be potentially infinite, right? So there is this kind of trade-off about what the ideal size and length of a token should be. If you keep the token length short, you are putting all the power onto all the responsibility onto the model to try and make sense of small differences in the token level patterns that you get when you are fed with a prompt. On the other hand, if you say, okay, let me just get the largest token, then you run the risk of having very large vocabulary sizes, right? So that's the trade-off here. And so we have many heuristics here to try and break up the text into what they call word pieces or smaller. They tried many things. They tried breaking it up into words. They tried breaking it up into phrases. They tried breaking it up into characters. Finally, they settled on these word pieces. Okay. Recall that the tokenizer is doing this, right? The tokenizer is the one that breaks up a prompt into its constituent tokens, right? Not after the model is trained. So what does the language model do? Well, the language model is fairly simple. It inputs a set of tokens along with their embeddings that we now know are embeddings. And these embeddings are independent of the context, as we clarified earlier. And then the output of the language model, it's very simple. It is the modified token embeddings that take into account the other embeddings. So how it works is, if I'm a token, I get an embedding representing me, irrespective of the context I'm in. You would get an embedding representing you. The fact that both of us are in the same room together, that context awareness between our embeddings, that context awareness is what the language model has been trained to change in our embedding space. So you can imagine that if I am a vector pointing this way and you are a vector pointing this way, basically 90 degrees to one another, those of you on the Zoom, the language model will figure out, okay, are these two tokens similar? Are they different? And accordingly, they will move the embeddings towards one another or away from one another in the 768 dimensional space. That's all they do. Exactly. They put similar things closer to one another. They put further things more far away. Is that clear? Okay. Oh, why does it need to find similarities? Because that's really what context awareness is about. From a philosophical perspective, any object only makes sense in its relationships to others. And so that kind of context awareness is what the language model brings to the table. The fact that I am teaching here a workshop is part of the definition of who I am. And that the fact that you're attending is part of the definition of who you are. So really, the context awareness between tokens is what really determines what a token even is. Right?
Basically, you tokenize input into your model, and it shows you how those tokens relate to each other.
That's it. That's all it does. Okay. And so you might think if the language model were sentient, it would ask things like, with respect to B, how important is O? If this was your tokenizer in the simplest case, right? Yeah, or with respect to CB, the joint of these two, how important is IO? These are the questions that the language model is trying to figure out among itself. I'll get to him first and then to you. Yeah.
Yeah. So how far does the model look at to look for the context?
So
Does it look at the entire input prompt?
So this is specified by something called a context width, which is the hyperparameter of the language model. Ideally, the smaller models have about 1,000 token range in which they can attend. We say attend to the different tokens, which basically means that one token is only being influenced by 1,000 other tokens around it. Your question.
If they're further, they're gonna move the guys that lead back to further part. This,
Kind of, yeah.
It's kind of like I was wondering how people rely on the series because they train a model and they found that is what it does. So they kind of find this principle, or it's because they know it, they prove it already, and they apply it to.
No, all this is done post hoc. So they first found out that the model works, and then they tried to give explanations to why it works. So there's, it's not totally inspired by this, yeah. Yeah.
I have a follow-up to my question.
Yes.
So you mentioned the hyperparameters, like the number of tokens
Yeah.
it goes, and so it doesn't take into account, like say, whether it's within one sentence or something like that.
No, but since the model has been trained with also full stops, the model also learns that, okay, these two sets of tokens are perhaps different sentences and so should be treated accordingly. So it's learned punctuations as well. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Yeah. So is it clear? So when we load in a prompt, we get independent context, independent token embeddings that don't depend on the context. And then it's up to the language model to take all these embeddings together and make sense of the joint representation of all these tokens. So let's look into the architecture in a bit. That's next. Okay. Do you have a question?
No.
Okay. Okay. Shall we move on? Okay. There's a lot here. There's some math, but it's not at all complicated. So there are two parts, as we discussed. We have the token embeddings here. Let us say that the 768 dimension that we were throwing around is D, right? So each token, Ti, is one, as you said, one-dimensional vector with 768 values. That's what this is trying to say. And we're saying that it's a column vector, so it's D cross 1. So we have these column vectors, and we have them stacked row-wise, so we have n tokens here. So you can imagine.
Wait, each one is 768.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Oh, it's not 172.
No. It is for every token, we have a 768 dimensional representation.
This is n plus 768.
Exactly, you beat me to it. So this is or we want to say rows first, right? So it's D cross N or 768 cross N.
Oh,
And in the case of this is an input text, you have 5 tokens. So in that case, for example, N would be 5 around there, right? This part makes sense. Okay, so now for every token, we get the initial embeddings. And then there's this black box that we don't know yet about. Okay, and at the output, we get the same tokens back, the same embeddings back, but the difference now is that these embeddings have all shifted. They have shifted in the 768 dimensional space to account for the other tokens. So if I pick a token Ti, it is being influenced over and over by this encoder in order to shift it with respect to the other tokens T1 through I minus 1 and Ti plus 1 till Tn. Yeah, if I pick a token Ti, then it is being influenced by all the tokens before it, which is T1 to Ti minus 1 to all the tokens after it, Ti I plus 1 to Tn. Okay. This part, and this is what we colloquially call the encoder style model. So when you work with LLMs, you would often see, if you go onto any open source domain, you'll see encoder style architecture. That is what that means. So we call this an encoder style architecture because all it does is that given an input set of tokens, it generates an output set of token embeddings that are slightly modified, perturbed. Is the left part clear? Okay. Now the right part, ignore what I say here as attention units. The only difference between what we call the encoder model on the left and what we are now going to call the decoder model on the right is that for every set of tokens D1 and D2 that I input into the encoder, the output is now a new token. Okay? So rather than outputting just the modified embeddings of T1, D1, and D2, in the case of a decoder model, I do the same thing, but the final output of this model is something like D3, and D3 is a new token, and we call this token to be generated by the model. Okay? That's tricky, so I'm going to repeat it. Yeah. They are two different classes of models, but they rely on the same underlying architecture. Okay, so here's an example. In the case of an encoder model, me and you are in the same room. We start off with our embeddings, and they align or disalign depending on our interactions. In the case of a decoder model, it's more like this. I start teaching, here's my embedding. Based on that embedding, I have learned to predict that your embedding will show up. So it's a small change there that if I start off by having a bunch of embeddings, then the model does all this contextual alignments, learns the context based on the token embeddings. The difference is, whereas the encoder only outputs the modified embeddings, the decoder does that, but additionally outputs what it thinks is another token that has to come next.
So the output of the thing on the left.
Yeah.
Is to the similarity of the top.
Yeah, it just tries to move vectors in and out. So in a genomic setting, when you have, I know very little about it, but if you have letters in a genome, ATGC, if you use a decoder style model to start generating ATGC, AT whatever, a random string, it's very difficult to make sense of what that output might be. This is one of the reasons why most of the genomics related architectures have so far resulted in encoder style models, where we just come up with a representation of the different, maybe a read or a fragment from the genome, and we just encode it rather than trying to generate new bases as a result of an encode sequence. I have to think of more. We can discuss later. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So you don't want it to. Well, in that case, then you can only like change the position.
In the encoder style model, right?
So you do the other.
Yeah. It's going to do something else. It's going to generate a new token for you. So in the case of ChatGPT, which style model do you think we're using? The second one, right? Because we are generating new tokens in this example, whereas in this example, it's all about creating a representation of the input, a contextualized representation of the input. We take tokens, we contextualize them with respect to one another, and then we generate a set of contextual embeddings for each token, and that forms like a basis for creating a numerical representation for the individual tokens and so on. Yes.
So for the ones like at the top, like with the hat,
yeah,
so it's the same token, but the embeddings change after.
That's right. It's exactly the same tokens. No, because in the case of chat, you want to be able to generate, it's a generative application. You want to be able to generate a new token.
Oh, yes.
Right, so you'd have to go here. Yes.
So when it generates new tokens, does it look through the whole dictionary space, like all of the possible tokens, and generates them based on something?
Based on?
Like probability or something?
Yes.
Okay, so it does look through all of the.
Yes, it does. It really does, yeah. So your peer is asking, how exactly is it doing the generation? So basically what happens is, after doing all this contextual shifts in the embedding space, what the decoder style model will do is pass all of these embeddings into another model that outputs some probabilities for the next token to emerge, some distribution across all like 30,000 tokens in the vocabulary. And it picks the most likely one, and that's how you get the next token.
So to go to the second one, you have to do.
You do. So the core is still the first one. This is just a wrapper on the encoder style model. Yeah. Okay.
So I was feeling this is also like a task game, because like when you're generating things, that until you finish it, you have good at this.
Yeah.
And how do you, like, as you said, there's like the probability.
Yeah.
Narrative, how is that done?
Yeah. So this is a great question. Your question is, okay, if I generate token by token based on a probability estimate that is constructed like just locally where I am, and if I make a sequence of choices, how can I guarantee that the composite generation after a series of tokens is actually a high quality generation? That's your question. And you brought in chess, which I think is a good example. And what I will say is that, in fact, I lied before. It is not purely greedy where you pick token by token. More advanced schemes use something called a beam search, which we'll get into later, but it uses a form of Monte Carlo sampling, which is in fact useful for also build chess bots. So there is a lot of similarity here in terms of looking ahead and picking one right now. Yes.
I guess a similar question to what asked before for
Yeah.
the tokens.
Yeah.
There's a hyperparameter for like say 1,000 tokens that they look at the context. So when they generate new ones, do they still have such hyperparameter? Do they kind of generate multiple ones at like together because they make sense together, or they just generate one and then move on to the next?
Yeah, so they do generate multiple together, but I think there's two parts to your question. The moving window of, say, 1,000 tokens or something, that moves. So the more you generate, the more this window keeps shifting. And so the prompt or what you had in the input at the earliest point in time, that is forgotten by the model.
Yeah.
So yeah, so there is a limited context window, and many recent language model improvements have been in trying to extend this context length to like infinity, to try and come up with small architecture changes that can actually create a long range token attendance kind of mechanics.
But does the sliding window also apply to the decoder?
Yes, it applies especially to the decoder.
Oh,
Because if you keep generating, at some point, you're going to reach 1,000 tokens.
so the ones that have been recently generated
Yeah.
will be used as input.
That's
to
right.
generate the next one.
Correct.
Oh, I see.
Correct. And the really old ones will be forgotten. Are we on the same page? Yeah, the greedy thing is if I generate just token by token, then chances are that maybe the composite generation may not be that good. So there are many added tricks that maybe we'll get into a little bit about how to make these generations of higher quality. Fairly clear? Okay, so let's move on. We will be okay for the large part. We tested this on the right side, but turns out that more of the easier to understand examples and in fact applications that I have encountered in genomics come actually from the first type of model. So we'll be playing around with both, but there's going to be an emphasis on the encoder style models first, and then we understand the decoder style models. Okay. So this looks very fancy, and it's a GIF. But what I want to specify here is that this is a very famous example that they've found online. And what we're trying to do is break apart a prompt into multiple tokens. And what we're trying to show is that between the tokens, during the LLM training process, what goes on and during inference, every token is attending to every other token. So you see that. So my representation of who I am, my embedding, my token embedding is going to be interacting with your token embedding in a certain amount, in a certain extent, to a certain extent, and that's what you see by this bipartite graph almost, right? And the weights along these edges depends on some kind of comparison between our embeddings. Okay.
And just a comment, this 78, as you say, that the representation is vector.
Yeah.
It should be related with the resolution of it.
With the resolution of
The computers. You doesn't get sent to this next figure because the resolution is not.
I don't know. I've tried to find the motivation for why 768, but honestly, I have not. I've not found a good motivation. You can have much longer vectors stored in computers.
No, but you can have, but it doesn't provide any.
Perhaps, but I don't know if people have really tested that thoroughly. But that's probably the reason why. Yeah. Yeah.
So you know the colored box.
I'll get into that in a little bit. So don't worry about it.
Say iteration.
No, I'll get to what they mean in a bit. Not yet. Yeah.
Yeah, I have, like, I know, I guess the 768 has no answers, but I wonder if it's just a sufficient number for people to use, or is it like one of the best number for people to use? Is it just kind of like a compromise between efficiency and,
The 768?
yeah,
Oh, as I said, I don't know. They just tried it and it worked. But beyond that, the point here is that every one of these tokens, have I got that down clearly? I mean, okay. Every one of these tokens has an embedding. Okay. Every token on this side also has an embedding. It's the same thing on both left and right. And we try to compute the similarity between the two, between a pairwise of all the embeddings, to figure out how important one token is to another. What that similarity is, we'll get into in a bit. If we want to deep dive into the math, we can do that. We have slides for it. But the fundamental idea is that these token embeddings influence one another and they get changed as a result. And as a result of that change, the embeddings get modified and they are more context dependent. Okay, yeah, questions.
So let's say that you and I put the same prompt, right?
Yeah.
Will the decoder model generate a unique like D3?
No, because oftentimes it relies on a sampling process across the probability distribution of the next possible tokens. But if you set it to a default setting, which is usually like a greedy output, it'll just take the max likely output. And as a result, you and I will get the same output D3s.
Okay.
But in ChatGPT, there is some amount of randomness provided to you. So you won't get the same output. Yeah.
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 If you type a question in ChatGPT, like, oh, like, explain this script to me, and then explain it to you, and then you ask it to explain it again.
It'll do a different job. It'll do it differently.
No, but you don't want to do it. I don't know.
People want to have it as a generative application, and so you want some amount of stochasticity in the generations. Yeah, question.
yeah. So when you tokenize your input,
Yeah.
You mentioned sometimes the like a word may be too rare or
Yeah.
it's not in the dictionary, so
Yeah.
you parse it into different tokens.
Yeah.
Like does the model still remember they were from the same word?
No, it doesn't.
And so in the encoder, they could be moved so apart that they are kind of
Absolutely, absolutely. But the model learns that if so I'll tell you that there is enough clue in the token itself to say that these two tokens are next to one another. And I'll give you an example of how that is. So if say the example Roy Chowdhury was broken up into 4 or 5 tokens, what would happen is that the tokens that you get, a token that's actually coming from within a word is usually prepended by a double pound sign. So you get a dedicated token to tell you that not only is it this word piece, but also that this word piece came from a subword. So those two tokens have their own embeddings and they're trained independently. So following so far? Yeah. I'll get to the colors, but that's a more subtle point, but I'll get to it later. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there a pattern by which the D3s are generated?
A pattern meaning?
Like, I don't know, like over time, does it learn which decoders to generate? Depending on the context?
There's no self-learning abilities that I'm aware of, but people are researching it actively. There are human-in-the-loop methods where as you interact more with ChatGPT and tell it that, okay, I preferred this output as opposed to the other output, it adds that to its training set, and in the next iteration, it improves the performance. Yes, there is a thumbs up, thumbs down, and that is used to augment to the training data. We'll get into the colors later, but that's the idea, okay? Basically, that tokens interact with one another and they attend to each other. Okay. Depending on how we're doing on, yeah, we're doing great, okay. More math. So what I'm going to do is just, this is not going to be useful for your quiz. It's not going to be useful for your homework, but just so that nobody accuses me of not getting into the depth of it, we're going into the depth of it. So it's very simple, actually. So M was the dimension of the token. N was the dimension of the number of tokens in your input. Fundamentally, if you know anything from this, all you need to know is that if I am given token embeddings in a 768 dimensional space, all that the encoder model is doing or the decoder model is doing, all of these large language models, what are they trying to do? They are trying to modify these embeddings such that the ones that are similar exist within the convex hull of these vectors. That is not a term you need to know. All you need to know is that you're trying to find a vector that pays attention to the other vector. So if I am x1 and my peers are x2 and x3, I am trying to modify my vector, my token embedding, from here to a small little change to t plus 1, right? Yeah, basically, it's what I have been saying, right? You have an embedding, and you want the large language model to move this numerical representation of who you are, of what the token is, based on the available tokens outside of your own token. And so based on that, if I have two other tokens in my context, x2 and x3, the goal of these large language models, and within the large language models, there are these things called attention heads. What attention really means is what it is. This vector attends to the other two vectors in the same context. And attention means that this vector would move in the direction of the other of the vectors within the same context. This is all it does. So what it does is that it computes some similarity. If I am a token, I compute a similarity with each and every one of you. And based on which token I seem to favor, I take a step in that direction. So say my favorite person or embedding or token in this room is you. I would take a step in your direction, right? And then in the next step, I still examine my surroundings, and then I notice, oh, it is still you, so I take another step in that direction. And I do this over and over in an iterative fashion through the model. And at the end, I am left with a modified token embedding than it was when I started.
So that's the T hat.
Yeah, that is the T hat.
Yeah.
So all the embeddings are moving similarly. So as I am taking these steps, everyone is taking their own steps. And so for every time our tokens attend to one another, our representations, our embeddings interact with one another, and we get more and more context aware, we try to find similarities to where all of us are in the room at any point, and we continue to take steps in the direction where the similarity is the highest. Is that clear? Yeah.
No, I like to, because it's not really, but it's not really. Okay. No, it's
Okay.
it's related with.
Oh, but this is really useful for like genomic, like classifying subtypes.
I see. Yeah.
Right? Because what if you could, like, what if you had two subtypes?
Mhm.
Like, ideally, the stereotypes cluster in the complex forces denoted by this. I don't know.
Yeah, they're useful for many tasks, including classification, especially the encoder style models, because all we're doing is moving vectors ultimately we can use these shifted embeddings as like a vector representation and then maybe train an SVM or some downstream classifier on these tokens to come up with a bunch of cool inferences from those embeddings. So does that make sense? Yeah. That is the model inferencing. So whether you're training or inferencing, it's the same process. You initialize an embedding in different spots based on what the independent tokens are being represented by. And because of the fact that all of us are in the same room, what the model does is that all of us end up taking steps, right, towards the people or other tokens that we think are more context dependent, and we do that over successive steps. Okay. So every step that I talk about is happening in one layer. These models often have multiple layers. And the more layers we have, the more steps I can take. So here's a question for you. Knowing that in every layer, these tokens are doing pairwise comparisons. This is a hard question. So, I mean, let's see. We're doing pairwise comparisons. So if in the first layer, I'm comparing pairwise, in the second layer, when I want to take another step, and if I'm comparing myself to you, what is it really? See, in the first layer, you compared yourself to everyone else. I compared myself to you. So in the second layer, when I am comparing my embedding to his embedding, in reality, it's a second order comparison because he has already shifted based on everybody else. So there's kind of a graph or a network forming here where every layer I go, the order of comparisons, the inter-token or pairwise token comparisons becomes more and more complex.
Wait, can you write it on the board?
Yeah, I can try. So
it's like the first time you compared to it, right?
yeah, so basically the first time I have a bunch of tokens, T1, T2, T3, right? I compare them pairwise.
Yeah.
But the next time I do the same comparison, and if I try to compare T1 to T3, in the next time step, this comparison is not just an effect of what T1 and T3 had, but also their mutual impact on T2. Because in this first step, all of these token embeddings have already moved in response to what T2 was. Basically, what you need to know is that tokens are being compared pairwise.
Yeah.
That's all.
So which token being compared pairwise? The first iteration, it's the token version.
Yeah, that's all it is.
The second order, it's still token versus token on the first iteration.
Exactly. So it's continual token comparisons. And because all of us are trying to find mutual similarities to others across multiple layers of the hierarchy, these comparisons become more and more intricate.
In the second layer.
Yeah.
If this, that it's moved differently because of the first.
Correct.
Okay. I thought
Yeah.
it was moved.
No. Does that make sense? That idea? Yeah.
When do the iteration end?
Yeah, so usually these models have about 6 layers or 12 layers. So they continually take 12 steps. That's how you can imagine it. Yeah?
It's similar to like neural network.
Yeah, exactly. The deeper you go, the more steps you take. So that's what, if you go back to this plot, you'll see that we had a toggle here called layer. That's what that means, right?
So what's layer 0?
Layer 0 means the first layer because people in computer science like to be 0 indexed.
Second layer would be based on.
Exactly, but the second layer would have different embeddings and therefore different attention extents. So if I want to attend to another token, those values would be different because now the tokens have shifted from the first layer.
So that would mean an improvement. Second.
It would mean that the model has more parameters to learn some more complex dependencies. Whether it's directly an improvement, I can't say, but usually people have found that more layers improves the performance.
Yeah, because I was thinking that if it understands, if it takes the steps.
Yeah.
In the first layer,
Mhm.
it gets that same second.
Yeah. Well, exactly, right? So maybe the first layer isn't sufficient to come up with a similarity, but maybe what the first layer learns is to move the vectors in such a way that going forward, that similarity can really come out. So in which layer these similarities get resolved, how many layers do you need for all the prompts? How many layers are necessary for simpler prompts versus complex prompts? These are all very exciting unanswered questions in large language models. Okay. The computer what? Yeah, computer does all this for you. Yeah.
Wait, would BERT made by someone that
BERT was, I believe, not made by someone.
Oh, sorry, BART.
BART? BART was used by people at UCLA. I haven't quite checked whether it was built by people at UCLA. Maybe you're right. I forget who the authors are. But so just going back to our first figure, there are fundamentally two types of places in which language models are used. The one that you see on the right side is the one that you've seen before. You present a set of tokens, I like cats more, and the sequential language model, or the one in which we go in an iterative sequential way, we then try to predict them. We try to predict a new token based on the tokens that were input. So these kinds of decoder style models that we discussed before are also called sequential language models. Okay? So these sequential language models are usually used for your ChatGPT models, like creative writing, conditional generation, translation, and so on. Does that make sense?
When you go into Google search, it tells you what
That uses something different. That does not yet use LLMs, at least as far as I'm aware. You can Google TRIE. That's the data structure they use for that. Okay. Now this one here is an instance of the encoder style model that we discussed before, the masked language model. So what does the masked language model do? That is similar to the encoder style model we discussed before. Basically, you give a set of tokens and you expect the embeddings to move around, and you generate the same tokens back. So what is the use of all this? One direct use is that you can do something called masked language model. What does that mean? Well, given the fact that I don't have a specific token in my input, these masked language models can use the encoder style architecture to shift tokens enough so that I can try to predict what the missing word should be. Okay? So sequential language models do not try to fill in, they try to generate what comes next. Masked language models use the encoder style architecture, where the same tokens are just contextualized, and for a missing word that's usually denoted by this mask kind of filler token, it can reproduce the output. It can reproduce a candidate missing token.
The encoder model is the one where they move the vectors.
All the models do that, but encoders models do not go further to try and generate the next token or the next token after that. Both decoder and encoder models use the concept of attention, but the decoder model is set up in a sequential way, where I input a set of tokens and I want to generate the tokens that come after. Make sense? Yeah. I know it's getting dense, but we will be quickly going to code and implementing all of this. So it's going to really get solidified, okay? Everything, yeah. Ignore this. Math for people who want it, but okay. This is a good time now to jump to the coding, but before we do that, it's a perfect time to take another 5-minute break, and we'll come back for some coding with LLMs. Okay, awesome. Okay, getting started here on the tutorial notebook for day 2, and hopefully you have all been able to load this up with no issues. And we can start stepping through some code. Okay, so we will go line by line, and there is a task at the end, so please keep your eyes peeled for that. It's not going to be easy. Okay, so we will step through it slowly. And the first line you see here, from transformers, import BERT tokenizer, BERT model, BERT for math language model. And you would justifiably be asking, what is BERT? Well, Sesame Street, yes. In fact, the icon for this model is also from Sesame Street, so they totally ripped that off. But BERT is one of the earliest architectures for these encoder style models. So BERT is an encoder style. And what you will notice is that we have imported BERT tokenizer, which is our usual tokenizer that we always wanted. And we have imported two functions that will become clearer later. But those two, the BERT model and BERT for MassLM models, are two ways in which we want to import an encoder style model. Again, we'll come to that in due time. Okay, not yet. Okay, so now the first thing we do, let's run this and see if it runs without any problems. Yeah. I'll show you how to get these in a bit. Yeah, this is day 2. And so, okay, looks like it ran fine. The next step here is to load the tokenizer and a model, right? So it's going to install some stuff. So it is fun to see exactly what's going on. The model safe tensors is the entire model that's being downloaded from the internet. Okay, so going back to your question, in this case, it's about half a gig. Config.json is just some configuration files. The tokenizer.json is telling you the mapping between the word, the token, and an index in the vocabulary. The vocab.text, I think together, the vocab.text, tokenizer.json, all of these are just tokenizer config files that basically specify the dictionary. But that's pretty much all that they're downloading. Okay.
So the next time that we use it,
you won't. It'll have pre-downloaded and it will use it from the cache. You want to try that? Let's see if it'll re-download it. Let's try rerunning this. Yeah, so it's already there. So now the next thing you will notice in this line is that in addition to the tokenizer, well, first of all, BERT base uncased, as you mentioned, has to do with this, with a particular model that someone else pre-trained. And this is an encoder style model because it says BERT. BERT will never be used in a decoder style setup. So if you see BERT, it's an encoder style model. BERT base refers to the fact that it's one of the smallest models. If you see a larger model, it would say mid, or it would be large, BERT large, or BERT mid. BERT base is one of the smaller models. Any idea what uncased means? Yeah, uncased means lowercased. So as you pointed out earlier, uncased basically refers to the fact that it's maybe there's a better modeling happening in a lowercase setting. So some people train the BERT base with uncased setting. So all the text during training, testing, and even training the tokenizer, everything was set to lowercase. So we're dealing with lowercase. Even if you did want to go from uppercase, it would convert it to lowercase before, processing it further. Okay, so that's the meaning of that string. Now, from pre-trained usually refers to I'm going to the cloud and downloading it. BERT for masked LM is different from BERT model, as you saw in the first line. The encoder style models can be imported in multiple ways. The BERT model will just get you the encoder style model. So again, the encoder style model in its most fundamental application is each token has a representation, it gets modified, and I get a modified set of representation. That is the BERT model. Sometimes we may feel fancy, and like I mentioned before, one example of an encoder style model is a masked language model. The masked language model is one in which, I have a context with a given word mask in it. And so this is an example of an encoder style use case where I am given a text, and rather than generating new text like a sequential language model would, I am trying to predict what comes in between this sequence. Internally, what's happening? Mask is given a vector, just like any other token. I want to, each of these comes up with its own, has its own token embeddings. And just like how I described, the BERT model attends pairwise to all the tokens over and over and over again. Mask finally ends up with a token embedding based on the context. And that embedding is passed into using that embedding, we get a distribution over the entire set of tokens in order to predict what should replace mask. Well, again, this is a tricky thing, but we usually don't use that term here. So we usually like to say it's a masked language model.
Oh, because
You're trying to fill in.
It has a vector. You want to optimize where that vector is.
True, and you're trying to fill in where that's.
So that's not generative.
It's not generative. Yeah.
Generating a vector.
Well, you are trying to shift a vector and put it in a place that respects the context. In both cases, you are only modifying vectors. The only difference is in a more, people tend to associate generative models to ones in which you can really generate a lot more than just filling in a mask. So it's more colloquial than anything. But more to your point, I guess so, you have a distribution across tokens and you're sampling to replace the mask. So if you want to call that generative, you can. Yeah.
Yeah, so does the model assumes it's only one word expected?
That's a very good question. Mask is only replaced by a single token in this configuration. There are additional configurations that allow you to have and fill in multiple tokens. But it's only a single token, the way it is currently written up. Yeah.
Can you have a full sentence with all like masks, or like most of them are masks?
So it turns out that during training, people have tried to do something like that. But during testing, it's kind of difficult to well, I know where you're going, and that is actually part of the task at the end of this notebook, where you're going to make a BERT look like a GPT model. But the simplest use case, you're just generating a single token. The mask starts with some some general embedding. Again, that's learned after using large-scale data. And then based on the context, the embedding of the mask keeps moving. And at some point, you're done with the model encoder style architecture. You take that embedding, you put it into some model that will give you a distribution across tokens, and then you find which token it corresponds to. Yeah. 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 It might give you a different result for sure, because it does modify the mask embedding in a different way. So if you change the prompt, either by extending it or by changing, by modifying it in any way, you will get a different output.
What if you say I want math and you call blah blah black sheep?
I think that's something that we will try now. So let's run these cells. That is how this has been trained, and our internal architecture takes care of that.
So you just like,
Yeah, you just write mask. Yeah. Question? I heard something on the Zoom video. No? Okay, let's try running a few things. Few cells. Again, here we just define the text. Yeah, it's as simple as just writing mask. And this is a loaded term, so it's not lowercase mask, it's not capital M-A-S-K, it's uppercase mask with a square bracket on both sides. That's just the way the pre-training was done. Yeah.
Does it have to be enclosed by space, full space?
Yeah, that's a great question again, because you want the model to make sure that it considers that whole thing as a single token.
Yeah, but you mentioned one word to be represented by multiple tokens.
It can be.
If you want it to be part of the I still do that.
You can still do that. Yes, 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 you can.
You see file, but you trace the file.
With mask and see what shows up. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
so for tokens, if you have a capitalized word,
Mhm.
uncapitalized tokens, two different words.
Yeah. It depends. If you're using an uncased model, it would lowercase everything and then apply the tokenizer. If you have casing, then both the cased and uncased versions have their own independent tokens. Make sense? Okay, so now we tokenize. And we can see how it split the text up into its individual tokens. Do we see that? Okay. Then we can find the index in our vocabulary by just doing, oh, I'm sorry. We can find the index of mask in our input among the tokens by just searching for mask. Is that clear? Okay. We do this because going back to a question that was asked in Zoom, basically, we never lose track of the ordering of the tokens in this entire model. Every layer you go, we still know that token A precedes token B. And if that's the case, then that's always going to be the case. So if I know at the input that mask is the third indexed token, at the output also, the third vector will correspond to the mask embedding. Nothing changes in the ordering there. Okay. Yeah.
What about it's in a different language that like the order of the words doesn't really matter?
It will still be the token sequence always is conserved in these models. There are interpretations of language models, in fact, where you can literally draw a line from each token all the way till the output. And these different attention models continue to change it. So token ordering never changes. Okay, great. So now we convert these tokens to IDs. So each of these tokens are now mapped to a specific index in the vocabulary. As you can see, we're repeating things over and over just to make sure that we understand what's going on. And then we convert, whoops, that's on me. Let's just add I don't know if we had it before, but we probably want torch. That's right. In the vocabulary, as we discussed before. And now we converted our list of token IDs to a tensor because this is going to be input into the model. Can anyone tell me why there are 2 brackets here and not 1? Why do we need 2 brackets and not 1?
Two-dimensional?
Yeah, but why two-dimensional? What does the first dimension stand for?
Are you in practice? You added in the practice.
Right, but why do we want it to be 2D and not 1D?
Because, oh,
Maybe.
Yeah.
It's, like maybe the other dimensions are for the iteration.
Yeah, so you're close. So you're all kind of close. So the first dimension here represents the batch. So you need not just infer from one text segment at a time. You can run this model across several masked text inputs at the same time. So there's some kind of concurrency that you can do. So the same model can be inferenced with multiple sequences of prompts. So if I am writing a prompt and you're writing a prompt or you're writing a prompt, the ChatGPT model doesn't run each of ours one at a time. It groups them up into this thing called a batch and runs batch inferencing. So you'll always see this, that in the first dimension in any kind of deep learning model is basically the batch dimension. So if you run a batch with a single input sequence, that's fine. If you run a batch with multiple input prompts, then that's fine too. But in that case, you're going to see multiple lists within this list. That's what the first dimension corresponds to. So if you try doing this without that first dimension, it will throw an error. So you have to be careful about that. Because it, by default, is meant to infer from using batches. The reason why is because it's more efficient that way. And why is that? Well, because of how hardware is constructed. Hardware likes to deal with matrices. And by having multiple input prompts being inferred at the same time, you can just put everything, you can pack everything into one matrix and just pass that into the model at one shot, rather than using individual sequences of embeddings. Think of it this way. If I have individual tokens with our embeddings going through an attention head, and if I want to take a step in a direction, the equivalent of what batching is that there's another class happening in the next room with all of our same embeddings. And we have to take a step in maybe another direction. What I'm telling us is that the hardware implementation of these models makes it more suitable to take these steps at the same time. That I can more easily process steps in this room and steps in that room concurrently, rather than taking steps sequentially one at a time. Okay, that's why we have the first dimension. You might have different rooms in which you still have to predict one word. It's not that we don't use batching for dependent tasks. We use them for independent tasks. If there are multiple people with the same task, that's when you like to use batching. But if you want to find multiple masked tokens and you want to fill them in the same instance, then it's a very bad idea to use masking for that use case. It's hard to do that, right? Yeah. So now we run the next cell, and we try to explain what's going on. Well, we pass the tokens into the model. That's what this is doing. And yeah, I'm like exposing us to the full underbelly of the model here. So, there's nothing to fear anymore. So we get outputs of 0. I think it's useful to see what happens in 1 and 2, but 0 is basically telling us to look at the first element in the batch, which is, we basically have this one element in the batch. So this is the first element. And we do 2 things. We print the predictions, and we print the shape. So this is the output of the model given these input tokens. Now it is left up to us to make sense of what was returned from the model. So I'm going to leave it to you. Any guesses what was returned from the model? These 2 correspond to the shape of the output. Okay. Any guesses on what these numbers are?
The number of tokens in the dictionary.
That's a good guess, right? Because we said that the token dictionary is between 10 and 50,000 roughly. And you see a number 30,522. So it turns out that you're right. 30,522 is indeed the number of tokens in this vocabulary. What is 8? What is 8? 8 words in the input, 8 tokens in the input. Okay, so we have 8 tokens. Let's go back to the tokens. We see 8 tokens, right? So our input had 8 tokens. Make sense? This part is tricky. I know it's a little hairy, but bear with me. This is probably the hardest part of the implementation. Basically, for every token among the 8, for the first input in the batch, we just have a single test case in our batch. We have 30,522 outputs. That's what the model is giving us as output. What is what? 8. 8 is the number of tokens in our input. The number of word pieces. Yes, we have only one input prompt, but that prompt, when you break it down into tokens, has 8 tokens in it. Make sense?
Yeah.
So the same input, again, recall that prompts are different from tokens. A single prompt has multiple tokens in it. So we have one prompt containing 8 tokens, and the model is returning 30,522 values for each token. Now I'll ask you a question. What do you think is in these? What do you think is in this? What do you think this matrix contains? I mean, what is the point of this? It goes back to an answer you provided, actually. So, yes, it's a tensor. So what this is really reflecting, not quite. Not quite. This is the output of the model. So you're done taking all the steps, and this is across 30,522. So this is across the vocabulary. This is reflecting for every token a distribution across all the tokens. Okay, so for a specific token among the 8s, let's say that the third element in these 8s was the mask token. Okay. The 30,522 values in this vector for one, and then the third token, and then the 30,522 values, they each represent a probability for every token that that mask is most likely to take. It's a distribution across the vocabulary.
Just the 30, 50?
The 3050, the 3522. So you might be asking, why are there 8? I only have one mask. You don't need an output for 8. And so we take care of that later. So if you just print the next part, again, we just look for the element corresponding to the masked index out of the 183522. And we just take the most likely token. That's all it is. And we find that the most likely token, actually, out of these 3522, is the 2022 indexed token, which in fact corresponds to the word or the token B. Okay. Yeah, I'll be repeating this many times, so don't worry. I'll go over the whole thing one more time. But B then is what mask is most likely to be replaced by. And so when you add it there and replace it, what do you get? You get, I want to be a new car, which is what this BERT model decided that mask should be replaced by. So we'll go through the whole thing one more time now. Things will get clear the second time over. Yeah, let's go through it one more time, not to worry. So here, we have a text segment. And at this point, only one of us, I mean, only one inference is needed. I mean, we don't have multiple inferences. We have a single text input sentence, and we want to fill out the mask. Okay. This basically means that in our batch of queries that we want to give the model in a group of queries, we just have one element. Okay. So what we do is we tokenize the text. This is pretty familiar now. And we get a list of tokens. Punctuations are honored, and we get 8 tokens. Do we see that? No problem here. And we also try to assign the index of the mask token to this variable mask index, which we will later use to query our output, to only replace the mask token. There's no reason to replace the others, right? The BERT model intrinsically does not know which of the tokens had the mask when you started off encoding things. All it sees are embeddings. And for every token embedding, it'll give you a probability over the vocabulary space to tell you which is the most likely token to replace that embedding. Okay?
Oh, so right now it's trying to lose everything.
Exactly.
That's it's like a number.
It's just a number, it's an index. So if you go up to the tokens, it's 0, 1, 2, 3. That's all it is, yeah. Right? And so now we convert the token to IDs. And so, and we take these IDs, we pass them into the model. Now, one subtlety that we haven't been able to show you here is that when you pass the token tensor into the model, that is where the embeddings are initialized. So you're not able to see the first version of all our embeddings being instantiated in this room. So the model has those embeddings saved within it. So it creates those embeddings, and then it takes steps for every layer in the model. And as and when it finishes taking those steps, then we can print the output after everyone has taken their steps. The 0 basically is telling us that it is the first element in the batch. Batch is merely saying that I only have one query or one mask, one task to do. If I had multiple tasks, I would have a batch size of more than one. So I would have 0.
It entered in which the 3 brackets in each array, but what is that? Like,
Yeah.
the first thing is self-printing.
Yeah, so that big multi-dimensional array has the size 1833522, and we are trying to interpret what these individual dimensions mean. 1 refers to the size of your batch, the number of queries that you want to answer. 8 reflects the number of tokens in that one sample that is in the batch. 3522 reflects the probability distribution across the 30,000 tokens in your vocabulary for every token in the input.
The 35 to do with the reflection of the vocab size?
Yes, that is the vocabulary size.
But that's model dependent, right?
That is model dependent, and that is the training data dependent also.
Okay.
Yes. So, yes, question. Yeah. Yeah.
So based on the factor, it kind of calculated this kind of
Yeah, so that's what you would hope, but in reality, that's just another neural network. So that's another fully connected matrix going from 768 to 30522. That just imagine that it's a linear projection from 768 to 3522. So there's a mapping that is also learned. Okay, so everything's learned. Yeah. Basically, for every token, I come to the output and the model delivers for me a distribution across the 30,000 tokens in my vocabulary. And then I go back and find where my masked index was. And I realize that the most likely token that this mask is supposed to represent is in fact B. And so the BERT model, this very simple model, decided that, okay, mask has to be B. And as a result, I want to be a new car. Does that make sense? So that's how it fills in. What's up? It's like transformers, yes. Yes.
Wait, I'm thinking, when you're writing your notebook for the class, do you want to say, I want to be a new car, or you just let it say that?
That's the cool thing, right? So we let the model figure out what it should be. I mean, if you did the same thing, you would also realize that the most likely token to replace the mask would be B. So there's nothing coming from me. It's all from the model side. Okay. So now to maybe clarify a few more things. If I don't want to, how am I doing on time? Great. So we will cover one more thing and then we can get into we will end it there because this has been a heavy session and we'll continue tomorrow after this point. Okay. So maybe to show you the complementary and more bare bones version of this, say you didn't want to do the classification in a masked language model, and you just want to do the encoder style model that we've talked about so far, where you just directly get the token embeddings, and you don't want anything else, right? So now what you do is the only change is, rather than saying BERT model for classification, you directly use the BERT model thing. So let's go back to see how we loaded the other model. We loaded it using BERT for masked LM, right? In this case, we load the same checkpoint, but in this case, we use the BERT model class. So we say BERT model, we load the same model again, okay? And here's a new text segment. QC Bio Collab is the real deal. And we tokenize the text. We get a bunch of tokens here. So back to your point about the continuation of a word. So you'll see that in this specific use case, collab is not really a word in the tokenizer. So it breaks up the collab into two words, two sub-tokens, cola, because Coca-Cola, and then it forgot how to deal, I mean, couldn't deal with the second part, so it said pound B, which refers to the fact that this is a letter B, but also that it is connected to the previous token that it came from. Yeah.
So like I wonder how it does like tokenization. Is it like greedy or is it like probabilistic?
There are details there that I'm not too familiar with, but people have tried greedy, people have tried some kind of a more, I guess they've tried dynamic programming approaches too. Where
Greedy, or just like greedy bandit?
So yeah, basically you try to find the longest substring that is in your vocabulary and then you go to the next one. But the problem there is that if you do it, you might find that the last one isn't in your vocabulary. So there are some difficulties. And people have tried to use, you can Google dynamic programming approaches for this and you'll find them.
Like, why is there a double hashtag for bio?
Yeah, so these double hashtags are meant to show you or are meant to tell the model that this token is different from the standard bio token because it is in fact associated to the previous the previous token. So a word can be split up into multiple tokens, and this is how they're being represented.
Right.
Do we see that?
Hey, I want to try something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, it's okay, I'll try it on my own.
Okay. So once again, we convert these two IDs, right? So we have, in this case, we have nine tokens, it looks like. So you can run all of them until the challenge. Okay, have we run everything until the challenge?
So it's
Yeah, so that's, you can just output the direct shape instead of associating it to another variable. That's fine. But what I want to show you is what's going on here. So once again, we have passed them into the model, right? And once again, it's in a batch, so it's single dimensional, but the outputs now contain two keys, two outputs in the model output. One is called the last hidden state. The other one is called the Pooler output. So let's look at the last hidden state. And what we see is what we expected to see, which is that the output is a 768 dimensional vector for each of our tokens. So what's gone on is that we've all been initialized with a 768 dimensional vector. It's gone through the model, and these are your output vectors for each token. So it's gone attended to one another after many layers, and for each of the 9 tokens, you end up generating a modified, updated, shifted 768 dimensional representation. So this is really the underlying, more core level model. Does that make sense?
different from the above.
It's part of the above, right? So in the above, we would take these representations and then try to find to which representation the masked vector is most likely to correspond to. In this case, I'm trying to directly show you the embeddings that are output from the model. No, we are not going to be confusing encoders and decoders. So there's nothing to do with the decoder here, because remember, decoder is a loaded term. We are reserving that to things like sequential language modeling and ChatGPT. Let's just call it embedding to token. So the embedding to token map is being added in the previous example. That's right. Make sense? Yeah, okay.
I want to know why it's 768.
768 because they tried it and it worked.
And then why is it not 30,000?
30,000, okay, so let me maybe give you a little more info on that. So if you did have a 30,000 dimensional vector for every token, what you are basically suggesting is that you want a one-hot encoded vector. So what that means is if it is a token I, then my 30,000 dimensional vector, where every index in that vector corresponds to a token because it's equal to the token dimension, is like there's a one-to-one map between the index and the token. So if I had the word B and B was of index 2022, then the initialized token embedding in the vector space would be 0, 0, 0, 0, and then there's a 1 at index 2022, and then zeros everywhere else. The challenge here is that when I am trying to find a similarity between this vector and another vector, it turns out that the similarity is being constructed in these large language models using the cosine distance. And if you try to find the cosine between two vectors that are one-hot encoded and sparse, there's a high likelihood that you will get a 0, or they will be orthogonal to one another. So the angle between these vectors is 90 degrees. So the cosine value goes to 0, basically. Cosine of 90 is 0. And so you can't really adequately get a distance metric. In layman's terms, if you project your tokens into a very high dimensional representation space, it is very difficult to compare these tokens among one another. The more convenient way is to condense it or to compress it into a more finite, I say finite for 768 dimensions, into a finite space where, you know, a comparison between these vectors can actually mean something. That's kind of a little bit of the intuition, but again, I cannot give you anything more than that. I think we're pulling at strings with 768. Yeah.
So that's why it's 768. That's why the above is not correct.
Well, we can't directly use the 30,000 dimensional representations for the model working. Rather, the 768 is a more compressed version of the token representation space that can be used for training the models in a more dense space, if you will. Okay, we have 10 minutes, and for the 10 minutes, I'd like you to work on this challenge that is there. The challenge involves trying to fix all the bugs and generating a suitable output, and let's see if you can try to get it to work. Oh, and the unmask here, basically, if you just want to test it out, I can do that with you.
Wait, sorry. This is the last thing we're gonna do. today.
That's right, yeah.
And you go up.
Yeah.
So the
What's the output last thing?
That is just a way to access the embeddings. That's just
Okay, yeah.
yeah,
that's
that's just the
what I
programming
thought. That's weird. That's
requirement.
what it
That's-
looks
yeah.
like. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry that's confusing. I mean, that's just how the framework has
It's
been
not
written.
confusing. I'm really tired.
That's okay, yeah, we're nearly at the end. I know this is rough.
how to access them, to actually do customers.
Yeah. So let's try to work on this little challenge here. It should not be too difficult. And then tomorrow we will continue from decoder style models and then go to applications. Does that sound good?
What is the application?
We will talk about applications to genomics, among other things. Oh, that's, we will be sharing the recording with you. So hope that works. Yeah. In the meantime, what I'll do is I will stop the recording of this workshop so that we can resume next week. So let me stop the recording here. What's up? Oh, sorry, tomorrow. Stop the recording.